All right, let's get right into it. Back in 1689, a book came out that dared to answer a question so dangerous it could literally get you killed. That book was John Locke's Two Treatises of Government. And the answer it gave? Well, it didn't just rattle a few cages. It laid the groundwork for the world we live in right now.
So what was this incredibly dangerous question? It was this. What exactly gives one person the right to rule over another? Now, to us, that might seem pretty straightforward, but you have to remember, back in the 17th century, the answer was considered absolute, and just asking the question was a revolutionary act.
For hundreds of years, the answer was simple, and it was final. God. This was the rock-solid foundation of every absolute monarchy. The whole idea was called the divine right of kings, and it meant that a king's power didn't come from the people he ruled, or from some long-held tradition, or even from military might. Nope, it came straight from God. So think about that. If you challenged the king, you weren't just committing treason, you were challenging God's will. It was, you have to admit, a pretty brilliant way to hold on to power. But that raises a really obvious and pretty terrifying problem, right? What are you supposed to do when the person God supposedly put on the throne turns out to be a total tyrant? Are people just supposed to sit back and suffer? This is the exact question that set the stage for a philosopher named John Locke to change everything. Locke came along with a completely radical new idea. He argued that our most basic, fundamental rights, they don't come from a king. They don't even come from a country's laws. They come from nature itself. And to explain this, he asks us to imagine something he called a state of nature. Now, this isn't some chaotic, violent free-for-all. For Locke, the state of nature was a state of perfect freedom and equality, a place where people are naturally guided by reason and a kind of built-in moral code. Everyone, he said, is born independent. You have to understand, this view was a direct shot across the bow at another major thinker of the day, a guy named Thomas Hobbes. And their disagreement on this one single point, what are human beings really like in their natural state? Well, it changes absolutely everything about what a government is for. And you can see right here where their paths just completely split. Hobbes saw people as naturally selfish and fearful. He thought without a strong ruler, life would just be a war of all against all, nasty, brutish, and short. So for him, the whole point of government is just security, plain and simple, even if that means a dictator. But Locke? He saw people as fundamentally rational and moral. So for him, the goal of government isn't just to keep us from killing each other, it's to protect the rights we already have. And that brings us to the absolute heart of Locke's entire philosophy, natural rights. These are rights you are born with, period. They are not granted to you by a king, which means a king cannot take them away. They exist before any government, and they exist outside of any government. So what are these amazing rights? Well, Locke boiled them down to a super powerful trio: life, liberty, and property. He argued every single person has a right to their own life, the freedom to make their own choices, and the right to own the things they create or earn through their own labor. This trio, this is the golden thread that runs through his entire argument. Which, of course, leads to a very logical question, right? If this state of nature is so reasonable, and we all have these rights anyway, why do we even need a government? Why not just stay in that state of perfect freedom? Well, Locke's answer is that while the state of nature is good, it can be, let's say, inconvenient. Your rights aren't always perfectly safe. So what's the solution? We make a deal. He calls this the social contract. The key word here is voluntary. I want you to think of it like a job contract. We, the people, agree to hand over a tiny little bit of our perfect freedom to a government. In return, the government has one job and one job only: to protect our core rights, our life, liberty, and property, way more effectively than we ever could on our own. And Locke's own words just make the basis of this deal perfectly clear. He says legitimate political power can only come from the consent of the governed. This was a total 180 from the old way of thinking. Power doesn't flow down from God to a king. It flows up from the people. Okay, so here's where Locke's idea gets truly, truly dangerous for the kings and queens of his time. Because if government is just a contract, what happens if one side breaks the deal? This is the fine print, and it's the part that gives all the power right back to the people. Locke lays out a simple step-by-step logic. Think of it as the contract's escape clause. Step 1, we agree to be governed to protect our rights. Step 2, the government turns around and violates the very rights it was hired to protect. Step 3, if the government breaks the contract, the people are no longer bound by it. They are freed from any duty to obey. This quote just captures that breaking point perfectly. For Locke, a government that acts without or against the law isn't a government anymore. It's just tyranny. And against tyranny, the people have the ultimate power, the right to revolt. I mean, the impact of this idea was just monumental. It wasn't just some theory for a philosophy class. It became the actual blueprint for modern democracy. Seriously, you can draw a straight, unbroken line from Locke's book in 1689 right to the American Revolution. When Thomas Jefferson wrote those famous words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he was basically channeling John Locke. And today, those core principles, consent to the governed, natural rights, limited government, they are the bedrock of constitutional democracies all across the globe. Now, of course, Locke's philosophy isn't perfect, and it's really important to look at the full picture. His heavy focus on property has been criticized for favoring the wealthy. Tragically, his ideas were twisted and used to justify colonialism in the seizure of land. His original concept of the people was, well, it was far from inclusive, and some critics just think his view of human nature is way too optimistic. But even with all of those valid criticisms, Locke's central idea is just as revolutionary today as it was in the 17th century. Power is not a right that rulers possess. It's a trust, given to them by the people for the protection of their rights. And that really leaves us with a huge question for today. These ideas literally built the political world that we all live in. But as we face brand new challenges, from digital privacy to global crises, are the principles of life, liberty, and property, as Locke defined them, still enough to guide us? Well, that's a question we all have to answer.